Hey guys, welcome to the Liberal Hive Mind, a channel solely focused on exposing the abundant hypocrisy of the left. It seems as though they still have yet to get the memo. This is not a thing that you want to be doubling down on. I know Democrats are trying to secure a win. I know all you leftoids are desperate for a talking point, desperate for something to say during this very contested election. But this one, it just ain't it. Literally anything but Letitia James's pathetic little case. You should say literally anything other than saying that Donald Trump is somehow guilty of committing fraud for his basic interaction in business transactions with banks. Literally anything else. Talk about abortion up to 9 months, that's a better play. Talk about men getting pregnant and defunding the police and you'll be 10 times more successful than arguing this nonsense. But as per usual, they still haven't gotten the memo. Leftists are under the impression that their only chance to win here, their only chance to take Trump down, is by casting him as a criminal. But in order to do that, you need something at least semi-believable. Mar-a-Lago being worth $18 million, not believable. Claiming that you're somehow guilty of fraud because you have a higher perception of value for the property that you own is ridiculous. Market prices are completely subjective, but apparently leftoids don't understand this. That's a lie, of course they do. They just choose to apply different standards to former President Donald Trump than anybody else. It's absolutely obvious. And even the ones that pretend to be the good guys, you know, the left-wingers who can call out both sides, who always see the truth, well, even they're full of it. We're talking about Jon Stewart today. Usually, the target in these types of topics tends to be Bill Maher, but this time it's Jon Stewart. You know, before this, I would have been willing to say that Jon Stewart is probably a little bit better than Bill Maher on this particular issue, but this is so incredibly dishonest. What a bunch of freaking clowns. Let me show you guys exactly what's going on. We got some stuff to get into, so let's roll the tape. All right, folks, so I want to start off with the Jon Stewart clip, but we got a bunch of other things to get into. Jon Stewart, of course, who's been pulled back to The Daily Show in the midst of an election season, I wonder how many millions they paid him, is doing his part to get Joe Biden reelected. Now, the question is he trying to get Joe Biden elected by promoting Joe Biden's incredible legislative agenda and amazing historic successes? No, of course not, because there are no historic successes and amazing legislative wins. So what Jon Stewart is opting for is straight up lying, accusing the former president of fraud with absolutely no actual legal description or justification, and then of course calling anybody who defends Donald Trump, in this case Kevin O'Leary, an a-hole. Great argument. Take a look at this.
The penthouse was a 30,000 square foot penthouse, I guess somehow including the sky in the calculation. And the Attorney General of New York knew that Trump's property values were inflated because when it came time to pay taxes, Trump undervalued the very same properties. It was all part of a very sophisticated real estate practice known as lying. So the judge calculated that the value that he gained from the lying with interest was around $454 million. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, that sounds pretty straightforward. Whatever gains you got from lying, you have to pay back. Well, that's because you're a idiot.
The ruling is blatantly unfair.
That didn't go over very well with the investment community because we're all asking each other, who's next?
Who's next? But I am surprised to hear this from Kevin O'Leary, a guy who's such an asshole. Wait. That even the other people on Shark Tank thinks he's an asshole.
What an absolute pompous fool. You know the left has no argument when they're pointing at Donald Trump, and you know the left has no argument when they're resorting to personal attacks. Sometimes ad hominems are justified. I'm going to be the first person to say that. Sometimes an ad hominem can actually be a great argument when it's really deserved, when it's proper. You know, I think using an ad hominem against Jon Stewart in this case, totally justified. But going after Kevin O'Leary in this instance, you're out of freaking line, out of pocket. Kevin O'Leary is correct. Jon Stewart attempts to make the argument that this wasn't a victimless crime. Okay, well, where's the victim, John? Please explain to me who was defrauded out of millions of dollars from Donald Trump's horrible fraud. That's right, no one. Trump made a ton of money, the banks made a ton of money. In other words, it was a business transaction gone right. Not gone wrong. There wasn't a fraud perpetrated where Donald Trump left with hundreds of millions of dollars while the bank was left unable to collect their money back or their interest payments. That never happened. Essentially, there was no crime committed. Kevin O'Leary is 100% correct, but Jon Stewart, the good guy, you know, the good leftist, swings into total propaganda mode, knowing he has a great relationship with the audience, that people trust him, and he decides to abuse that influence, that position of authority to push this nonsense. I mean, what a bunch of dishonest, frankly horrible people. Democrats are purposely misrepresenting information, actually making this argument that Donald Trump misrepresented the value of his properties. But what they're really doing is conflating assessed value, tax-assessed value of a property, is something that's ascribed to a property from local governments. The government will come in, they'll usually have a structure where they measure the square footage, possibly materials used, location, amenities, whether you have a patio, whether you don't, and based on going through this checklist, they ascribe a value to your property, which then determines the tax bill that you're going to have to pay on a yearly basis. A lot of the times that government assessed tax value is much lower than the market value because their arithmetic is based purely on the space itself and the materials used, the physical attributes of the property, not the emotional. And here's where these leftists start to look like complete fools. Jon Stewart claims that Donald Trump is guilty of fraud because he personally believed that his properties were worth more than the assessed values, like literally every other human being on earth, and he got loans from them, meaning after the banks did their due diligence, they said, yep, we agree with the value, we're going to give you this much money. He claims that that's fraud, but back in 2017, it turns out that Jon Stewart overvalued his New York City home by 829% after slamming Trump's civil case as, quote, not victimless. I mean, holy, I'm certainly not surprised, but wow. Let's take a look at the article. I know a lot of people have been talking about this lately. Jon Stewart sold his 6,280 square foot Tribeca duplex for $17.5 million in 2017. I believe this is the same duplex, although it might be another one. Anyways, it's comparable. It's either Jon Stewart's property or a similar one from the same building, so take a look at the property. He sold that for $17 million. Makes sense in the middle of New York City. Such amazing space and amenities. It's a duplex penthouse, for Pete's sake. $17.5 million seems appropriate. However, the tax valuation, the actual assessor valuation, was only $847,000, and the property had an estimated market value of only $1.9 million, but he sold it for $17 million. And it's funny because the person who purchased it from him, an individual whose name I'm going to black out because it's not really relevant to the story, well, that person purchased the penthouse from Jon Stewart back in 2014 and then resold the property at a 26% loss, according to The Real Deal, at just over $13 million in 2021. So did Jon Stewart defraud the person who bought his home because he sold it at such a crazy markup from the assessed value? And then that person ended up losing money on the resale? No, it's called real estate. It's called market prices. They're totally subjective. You know, let's say you had 10 people who had the capability to buy Mar-a-Lago, the whole thing. You might have one person come in and say, you know what? I think this property is worth $150 million. Trump's response would probably immediately be take a hike. The next person might say 500. The next person might say $1 billion. It's totally subjective. Market value is based on what people think or are willing to pay for it personally. From Trump's view, his properties were worth X. But Democrats are telling you that that's fraud and that only the tax assessment is relevant. Mar-a-Lago is worth $18 million. Trump can only secure a loan of $18 million on that property. Not factoring in any of the revenue. I mean, it's a club. It's a business within itself. It's a private club with over 100 units for its club members. That alone is easily worth, I'd say, upwards of $200 million a minimum on paper. It's a property that's probably generating all kinds of freaking money. I mean, boatloads of money, and that justifies a higher price. But the New York courts deem that to be fraud. If that's the case, Jon Stewart's guilty of fraud. If that's the case, everybody's guilty of fraud. Anybody who ever refinanced a home, you're a fraudster. Anybody who ever sold a home higher than its tax assessed value, you're a fraudster. Absolutely absurd. The only people who messed up here, well, aside from Democrats taking this ridiculous stance, that's a political mess up, but in terms of this Trump situation with the bank, the only people who, I guess, made mistakes, even though they didn't, the only argument is that maybe the bank made a mistake. Maybe the bank accepted an assessment which they shouldn't have. How does that fall on Trump's shoulders? That's their job. I personally own a couple properties. I mean, obviously what I do is a very small scale compared to what Trump is doing, but even when I'm trying to rent something, if I'm trying to sell something, the value of my properties and the rent that I want to charge is always going to be a higher number than probably what the renter's looking for or what the potential buyer's looking for. That's called basic market dynamics. You might think your property's worth $1 million, but the person buying it thinks, well, you know what, for me it's more like a $799. But the person who wants to purchase the property might be landing at, let's say, $850. Does that make you guilty of fraud? Absolutely not. It's all completely subjective. The actual price of a property, the actual market value of a property, is based on what somebody is willing to pay for it. Or I guess in this case, the price of Donald Trump's properties was whatever the banks were willing to loan against it for. I guess it's pretty safe to say that I'm very disappointed in Jon Stewart. What a weirdo. After that little segment, he's just as bad as any leftist talking head in the mainstream. People might have given him the benefit of the doubt in the past. Well, he's proven that he deserves none of that benefit. Anyways, that's pretty much what I got for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and possibly subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.